Hey everyone, today we're asking the question of what was DBD's best meta. This was a question I wanted to ask because to me the worst meta is pretty clear, but when I tried to think of the best meta, I kind of came up with nothing. I asked some of you too, and the answer was always pretty vague, or there was no clear point or meta that was considered good or healthy. First, let's talk about what I believe was the worst meta to maybe get some perspective. To me, it's late year 4 to early year 5, when Freddy was in his prime, slowdowns were the key to winning games, and survivor perks were almost exclusively gen rush or second chance perks. Therefore, the opposite of this would be what? A character that doesn't rely on any slowdown, has no or little regression perks, and survivor builds that have maybe a single second chance and nothing that speeds up gens. This just places us back at square one, where it's kind of just the same, only the game would be a bit quicker without the slowdowns, and the survivors' slowdowns. One key thing I think that is true about DBD's meta is that it hasn't ever really changed, depending on how far you decide to zoom out when looking at it. Nurse has always been the best pick, and still is, for nearly 7 years now. Gen regression and slowdown perks are still the best. For survivors, exhaustion perks are still the best, or perks that speed up gens or heals. It's pretty much always been this way, with only a few outliers. The current meta to me isn't that bad. I think we've had far worse. That doesn't necessarily mean that the current one is good though, but I think we're definitely not in the worst spot we've been, and it's not even that close. I think the fairly recent perk changes did do a lot for shaking the meta up. Even though there are standout strong perks, they aren't always the most used perks anymore, or there is more of a spread at least. My recent stats video where I looked into the pick rates of perks for both sides, it was pretty surprising the outcomes. This kind of surprised me, because none of these are problematic in my opinion, and are all quite balanced. So where's the problem exactly? So I asked you all what you think the best meta was, and what meta you would like to see. I got a lot of different ideas and comments from all of you on what the perfect meta would be, and why the current one was a problem, and what the previously best meta had been. I saw 3 primary themes or 3 primary points being made. People like metas where they felt strong respectively. For example, survivor players appeared to have liked the DS Unbreakable, Dead Hard and Iron Will meta of year 4 and 5, because they felt strong. Players on the other side enjoyed 200% double ruin undying, because it made them feel strong. The second thing that came up recurringly was that people liked the idea of a meta with lots of variety, or essentially no meta. This was also referred to as being a fun meta, or a variety meta. As kind of a third recurring thing too, people like the idea of a chase-based meta, instead of what was referred to as the current gen regression or gen kick meta. Let's address this idea of a chase-based meta quickly. I think the idea of a chase-based meta is inherently flawed and doesn't really make sense, because the game's core and primary mechanic is generators, and that won't change unless there is a fundamental change in the game's core gameplay. The balanced landing meta was brought up a lot too when referring to a chase-based meta. The balanced landing meta, I believe, refers to when balanced landing had its passive stagger effect when falling from a height. This meant you could pair it up with other exhaustion perks. You could use it to further extend chases, and it was essentially a support perk to your main exhaustion, comparable to something like Vigil, except it was more active during a chase. This was healthy at the time, I think, in terms of broadening exhaustion perks into utility perks, instead of just being distance or chase perks. But it wasn't healthy in the sense that it allowed and supported infinites. It's a nice idea to center it around chases, but then what are the other 3 survivors meant to do? Gens, right? If the back and forth is going to be centered around looping and chase, and perks are buffed on both sides, chases will be longer, which just leaves more time for survivors to do gens. If you greatly buff the non-survivor side, you get a situation where chases are too quick, and now they're unfun. It's tricky, which is kind of the problem. This is also a kind of similar and good point here that Jaden raises. If you want no regression, we also need no tools for survivors to gen rush. This then however leads to an issue where the two things have simply countered each other, and things will just stay the same. It's the root of a lot of DBD problems, I think, that when you nerf one thing, it doesn't just weaken the side it's being nerfed on, but it typically strengthens the opposing side too. Ultimately, the idea of building a meta around chases instead of gens doesn't work, I don't think, because at the end of the day, gens are the main objective. Chases are similar to slowdown or regression perks. They are the survivor's way of slowing down the pursuit of the killer. Even if perks relating to chases specifically were buffed, I don't think we would see a reduction in gen-based perks. This was evident, I think, after the gen time increases in 6.1.0. To many, gens still can seem too fast. Chases are a one-on-one thing, so centering a meta around them would mean you would need to buff perks for both sides, which just makes chases longer, and ultimately leads to gens popping too quickly, because you can't down anyone quick enough. Basically, gens have to be the center of the meta, because they're the main objective at the end of the day. If we were to center it around gens, it would mean a back and forth would be required, and potentially the equivalent of eruption-like perks would need to be buffed, these being things like Repressed Alliance or Blast Mine. This then probably leads to gens becoming too slow, and there being too much of a back and forth, so it's tricky, I think. Let's talk about the other two now, the powerful meta and the variety meta. This comment from Iridescent Scruffy is one I liked a lot. I agree a lot with it, and this thing of metas before DS Unbreakable, Dead Hard, and Borrowed Time, that's the thing. It's a very recent change, that these things weren't meta, with them prior being meta since each of their respective releases. 6.1.0 I would debate was the first significant or truly noticeable meta shift in the game's 7-year history, and I don't say that lightly. Interestingly, the point that was referred to as one of the best for the game, or the healthiest meta, was just after 6.1.0, when no one really knew what the meta was. There was specific mention too of it being especially good because after Dead Hard's change, no one really knew how to use it. It was this kind of discovery period. The funny thing about this is that people's idea of a perfect meta, or the closest to that, was when there wasn't a meta, or when the meta was still being decided. I think I tend to agree with this too for a game like DBD, where balance has always been out of reach, and variety is the thing that largely makes the game fun. You can choose variety with perk builds, but you're also forced into game variety with maps and the type of character you face. Variety is inherent to DBD's gameplay. Post 6.1.0 was some of the most fun I've had in the game, where after every match, survivors had almost entirely different perk sets, and things just had so much variety. Perks that had been long established as strong were no longer viable, or shadows of their former selves. Regression perks like Ruin and Pop were genuinely destroyed in terms of value. Dead Hard now required skill, and perks like Decisive Strike had been so heavily restricted, you had to now use it as it was intended. This is pretty much the same perk set or meta we have now, only back then, people were just coming to understand it and make sense of how the new perks work together. With the current gen kick meta, I think the frustrations boil down to survivors disliking gen regression perks, which isn't anything new, but more specifically gen regression perks that force you to wait. Eruption is the clearest problem in this case, where it forces you to let go of a gen, or be forced to let go of a gen later on. Even Pain Resonance is a bit like this. Dead Hard kind of does the same, hit now or hit later. I don't think people necessarily hate Eruption purely for its regression, but more because it makes you unable to do anything for 20 seconds. It's a similar reason why I don't like facing characters like Doctor or Clown. It doesn't feel good to be forced near immobile, or incapable of doing anything. Eruption is particularly frustrating because there's not really a way to counter it. You're forced to stop what you're doing one way or another. People also don't seem to like regression perks that result due to inaction or activating passively, with things like Ruin or Eruption, where there is no action or a simple gen kick. The regression needs to be earned by playing well, or hooking someone. Pain Resonance, I think most would agree, is fair. The same goes for current Dead Hard. You need to time it correctly with a window of half a second. That's pretty fair, I think. Despite this, the two of these kind of force some degree of needing to wait. The clearest answer or outcome of what the best meta would be, therefore, is a meta that is forever changing. Ideally one too where there are perks that make you feel powerful, but there's also things to counter that power for the other side, and ideally many other powerful options to counter these powerful things. I think a healthy amount of change would be every 3 months or so, potentially on the turn of a chapter or a mid-chapter, where things could be shaken up and new perks come to the spotlight. Potentially on a smaller scale, I think this would be a great use for the Shrine of Secrets. Make the perks that appear in the shrine slightly buffed for the week, and then continually, week by week, incentivizing people to use different perks. The ones that end up actually being popular or balanced can then be brought along as a permanent change. It would keep the game so fresh and engaging, having the meta quite literally shifting week by week before you. Maybe it's a little much, I'm not sure. Let me know what you think down below. What was your favorite meta, and what would be your ideal meta? Thanks, and okay, bye! Thank you for watching.